35, entitled A Plea for Mercy. It's one of our short psalms. As a matter of fact, it's the last of our short psalms, the fifth of our short psalms, and it is Psalm 123. I don't know if you noticed or not, but I am standing rather than sitting. This is a different sequence of events taking place right now. So if you see me wandering around, you'll know why. We're looking at Psalm 123, as I said, which I've entitled the longest, shortest psalm. And it's the fourth song of ascents in the series of 15 that began in Psalm 120. And this psalm is interesting. It looks like a combination of a lament and a prayer for Yahweh's grace and mercy. Because of that, many scholars believe that the psalm was likely written or penned during a time of strong oppression or persecution. Perhaps it could have been during the Babylonian captivity. The Babylonians, of course, were not known as particularly nice captors, and they would have been under severe pressure and oppression at that time. But others say, well, it could also have been after their return from the captivity when it was a situation where the neighbors, if you recall the book of Nehemiah, where the neighbors of Israel did not want Israel regaining its strength in the region. We don't know, really. Some have even proposed that maybe it was some kind of a split within Israel that caused the problems. We simply don't know. But in any event, it is a prayer for release from some unhappy condition or conditions. The opening two verses praise and exalt God, the God of Israel, Yahweh, while the closing three verses enlist his grace, mercy, and his deliverance. So he's going to praise and exalt God, and then he's going to ask for relief. He tells us up front in the first two verses, we know who he is petitioning, who the psalmist is petitioning. But it's only at the end, in verse 4, I believe it is, where he discloses the actual source of the problem that's facing the Israelites. Let's look at verse 1 in Psalm 123. It says, I look up toward you, the one enthroned in heaven. He's declaring his personal trust in someone he calls you, which is a relatively familiar term, isn't it? You assume that he knows who this individual, this personality is. And he's declaring his personal trust. That's why he's looking up toward him. And he calls him the one enthroned in heaven. That is, this would be the sovereign of the universe. In our terminology, the name above all names. Now, the psalmist uses the phrase, look up or lift up my eyes, which is a typical Old Testament expression for prayer. It also is a typical Old Testament posture for prayer. Now, Jesus did the same thing. You can find an example of that in John 17:1. It says, when Jesus finished saying these things, he looked up toward heaven and said, Father, the time has come. Glorify your Son so that your Son may glorify you. You probably recall that this is the introduction to his series of three prayer segments in the upper room on the day before his crucifixion, when he is petitioning about himself. He's petitioning the Father about himself. He's petitioning the Father about his 11 disciples who have been faithful to him. And he's petitioning the Father about those who will come to believe as a result of the work of the 11. But the key again is he looked upward toward heaven. Now his disciples would have made a connection with those words and phrases from the Old Testament. They would have known why Jesus raised his eyes to heaven. That wouldn't have been a mystery. We even know why that would occur. But our psalmist, in referencing heaven, declares that his God is where? On the throne. What? Sovereign. Doing what? Reigning. So he's got the you, his enthroned one who is sovereign and reigns over the universe. No question about who he's speaking about. As a matter of fact, in verse 2, he's going to tell us the name of the one he's looking at. But the question that needs to be answered is, okay, psalmist, how long are you willing to ask this sovereign for his help? How long will you hang in there? And so in verse 2, his humility shows. He said, I'll keep this up as long as it's necessary. So let's look at verse 2 of Psalm 123. Look, as the eyes of the servants look to the hand of their master. Now, why would they do that? The servant is on a lower status or plane than the master. So you have a lesser, the servant, a greater, the master in this relationship. Why is he looking to the hand of the master? Because he wants the master and expects the master to do whatever is needed to solve whatever problem he's speaking to them about. And you see this simile, which is what that is, a picture, a simile of a separate second, same kind of event, same kind of petition, same kind of simile. As the eyes of a female servant look to the hand of her mistress. So here again, you have a lower level female servant, maidservant if you prefer, who is looking to the hand of her mistress, the one who is greater in this relationship in some way, shape, or form. Looking to the hand of her mistress, meaning looking to the mistress for her ability to solve whatever problem the maidservant has faced. And now he makes a comparison. So my eyes will look to the Lord our God until he shows his favor. So we see several things. Here we have the third simile. Me, lower in level in some respect, to the Lord Yahweh, names who the Lord is, our God, who is other, he's separate, he's above. So here you have the lesser to greater relationship again. Until, how long? Until he shows us favor. In other words, he's claiming that this petition that he's making, he will continue until God answers this prayer. Now, this is also known as a lesser to greater argument. He's using two examples from an earthly situation, master, slave, maidservant, mistress, the earthly relationship of those two, to a higher level relationship between a believer and his Lord, is our God. And that's called a lesser to greater argument. The first three were lesser to greater relationships put together to make a lesser to greater argument. He's saying, if this is a reasonable way to look at relationships, master to slave, mistress, maidservant to mistress, that's the same way I should look at my relationship with my God. Well, So what do we have? Well, let me see. I'm puzzling here for a minute. Notice the one who's doing the prayer, which would be the psalmist, is comparing earthly relationships of trust, the lesser of the two, to a heavenly relationship of trust, which is the greater relationship. I'm repeating myself somewhat. But notice there's another shift in the final segment of verse 2. It's subtle, but if you look at it for a minute, it's rather clear. In verse 1, it was a personal focus, I, me, my. But here at the end of verse 2, it's us and our. So he says we're going to keep this up for a long time, and he's going to keep it up not only for himself, but for the entire corporate body of Israel. So what has he done? This is rather interesting. Over the two verses, there's a transition. He begins by referring to God as you, as if it's a familiar relationship. But then he says enthroned, which means God is greater. He's other than us. He's not one of us. He's other, greater, above in some respects. And then after just generalizing to a greater other God, he names him Yahweh, using Lord, capital L, and then little caps O-R-D. Yahweh. He names him our eternal God, the one who said, I always have been, I am, I always will be. The name Yahweh actually is a statement of God's eternal existence. Or if you're into philosophy, it would be an uncaused cause. God wasn't caused, he just was. And then the final step is to call him our God, meaning our master, our sovereign, the one to whom we have responsibility. So he's told us who he's petitioning for this relief, but he hasn't told us yet from what he's petitioning relief. But we get into verse 3, we're going to begin to get an idea. Now, this is where he begins the prayer for mercy, deliverance, and so forth. He wants the hand of God to get in here, take care of this problem. And if you look at the ending of this verse, you want to be careful with it. Let me read verse 3. Be gracious to us, O Lord. Be gracious to us, for we are greatly filled with contempt. Now you want to be careful of that ending. We are greatly filled with contempt. He's not saying that God's people are contemptible or that God's people have serious problems with contempt. And what he's saying is, hey, Lord, we've got a gut full of contempt from all these other oppressors. Or we might say it, look, Lord, I've had it up to here, meaning up to the neck, with the contempt of these people, with their contempt. And their contempt is for me, their contempt is for my God. I've had it. It's all I can handle. Lord, I need you to step in and put an end to this. Well, Jesus, we know, was treated with contempt, usually by religious leaders, right? We see some of that in Matthew 16:21. He sort of just summarizes it. He says, from that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and experts in the law, all the religious elite, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. This, of course, was where he was preparing for his final entry into Jerusalem, followed by the cross. So the psalmist and all Israel had had enough of the contempt and scorn that they were facing. In whatever situation it is, as we said, we don't really know, but he's just simply asking for relief. So he asked God to change his situation by looking upon his servant with favor, or servants, since it was, in essence, a corporate plea. Now, finally, in verse 4, we're told the source of this humiliation, scorn, taunt, contempt, whatever you want to call it. And that source is, not surprising, arrogant unbelievers. There's nothing worse than an unbeliever who is arrogant if you want to have a battle on your hands. Let's read verse 4. We've had our fill of the taunts of the self-assured, there's some arrogance there, of the contempt of the proud. So it's the proud, the arrogant, the uppity unbeliever who is so self-assured, so self-aware that he's simply saying, you guys are nuts. Your God either doesn't exist or is powerless. And a lot of Old Testament times, people said your God can't do anything and found out otherwise in a hurry. They found out that our God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, can do many things that unbelievers do not believe he can or will do. Yeah, in the use of the word the proud, you can get an idea because it's also translated those at ease, the nonchalant, the arrogant, uppity, so forth, so forth. So, is there a takeaway of some basic principle the psalmist is getting at? Well, I think there is. I think he's saying, look, when your faith and you are taunted, and God is taunted as well, when you're taunted, when your faith is taunted, God is taunted, but God may be directly taunted as well. Whenever you see that, pray for God's mercy intervention. And then, of course, if you go to the New Testament where Paul's speaking, he says, pray without ceasing until you get your answer, which may be relief, it may be some other form of answer. There's a simple case study in the New Testament where that sort of persistence in faith and going to the one who can solve it is seen. And it's where Jesus is coming into Jericho on his way to Jerusalem and to the cross. We see this in Luke 18:36 down through the first part of verse 40. What we've got is a blind guy, and remember what his name is? Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus. And when Bartimaeus heard a crowd going by, he asked, what's going on? And then they told him, I guess the crowd or whoever's going by, not sure who it was, that told him, Jesus the Nazarene's passing by. So what did Bartimaeus do? He called out, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Now notice, that means that Bartimaeus was not ignorant of who Jesus was. Son of David was essentially the same as calling him the Messiah. Jesus, Messiah, have mercy on me. He knew he could depend on mercy from Jesus. And those who were in front of Bartimaeus, however, scolded him to get him to be quiet. Knock it off, Bartimaeus. You're messing up this process going, this parade going by, if you please. But what did Bartimaeus do? He shouted even more, Son of David, have mercy on me. What happened? So Jesus stopped. Bartimaeus got his answer immediately. And if you remember the combination of the stories, you might find that there's more than one blind man. who received his sight. Someone, I assume he was a psychologist or a psychiatrist, something of that sort, that made a statement similar to this. Contempt by one person for another person hides a sense of sovereignty. Notice that's a pretty strong warning. He's saying if you show contempt for someone else, in some way you believe you are better than they are. And of course, God doesn't have that viewpoint. He's made it a level ground in front of the cross. So for the Christian, contempt for another is not acceptable. Pure and simple, I guess. And by the way, who does have a right to look at human beings with contempt? Well, the only one who is sovereign by nature over creation. That would be the Lord our God. Now, there's another point. I don't know how critical it is, how important you think it is. But if somebody is pestering you, and they've just begun pestering you with some remarks or whatever, it's a natural tendency to ask them to stop. Did the psalmist do that? The answer is very clearly no. He went to God, not to the persons or organization, country, whatever it was that was causing the problem. He didn't bother with them because it evidently was an ongoing sort of thing. Let me pose it this way. Suppose that a particular nastiness involves oppression or persecution by some foreign power, some country, even perhaps to the enslavement in some way, an enslavement in some way. Notice, do you go to that country and ask for relief? Well, the psalmist didn't. He went straight to the true power, Yahweh. The psalmist evidently sees himself as a slave of Yahweh only, and only petitions Yahweh for relief. Is that enough said about this? Well, let me ask you, what do you think is next? We've completed our shortest psalm series, which we started with Psalm 1 and 2, and then went to these 5 psalms. I think what we're going to do is make a shift and go to a study of Bible books, individual books or letters and communications, by looking at them verse by verse, chapter by chapter, through the entire book. No skips, no jumps, no weaseling out of something that's difficult. We'll look at them all. But what books? Well, maybe some books you've not really spent a significant amount of study time in. The minor prophets, which begin with Hosea and go through about 12 books through Micah, not Micah. I'd do that every time. Malachi. Hosea is the first of the minor prophets, Malachi being the last. And remember, Malachi is particularly significant because once Malachi's prophecy was given, there was no further word from God in Israel for over 400 years. So right now, my thinking is we'll begin with Malachi, follow Malachi with Hosea, which is another powerful, powerful story of God's love, and then look at some of the other books in the minor prophets. Anyhow, I look for you next time.